Get Better Soon. Written by Wada Fix. Read by Arashi. When Ferdinand first opened his eyes, he was surprised to find himself in the infirmary. He stared at the four white walls, blinking away the blurriness that remained in his vision. There was no one else in the room with him. An empty cot was to his left, and the pale blue curtain that was meant to separate the two sides of the clinic was currently pulled apart. Since there was no one else within the room, there was no need for the curtain to be used as a barrier for privacy between patients. Scanning the area, Ferdinand noticed that everything was quite clean. That was only natural for most medical operations, but Professor Manuela was a special case. It was a common occurrence for her to be over-inebriated, but it seemed she kept her workspace tidy at the least. The white cabinets were all locked and shut, to keep any prying hands from trying to steal various medicines, potions, or tonics from the academy. The counters were also barren, except for a single stack of papers that was sitting near the ledge by the doorway. It appeared as if someone had dropped them off before leaving the infirmary. Turning his head, Ferdinand was surprised to find that the nightstand beside him was not empty. There was a glass pitcher filled with water, as well as a cup for him. Sitting up against the stiff pillows, Ferdinand reached to pour a glass of water. He hastily brought the cup to his lips, sipping as if he had been left to dehydrate in the middle of a desert for days. His body felt unbelievably sore, especially across his lower back muscles and right leg. He noticed that his ankle was currently tied up with a brace, though it did not appear to be broken. When he tried to wiggle his toes, he managed to do so with a small grimace. Glancing out the window, he noticed that the sun was nearly set on the horizon. How long had he been asleep? The last thing he could remember was when he had been on his horse in the middle of a training exercise with the Golden Deer House. It had been a pretty steady mock fight between both sides, and Ferdinand had recklessly charged forward upon his horse. Wielding his wooden training lance, he had gotten out of the battle position Byleth had taught them prior. Hence, an accident occurred due to Ferdinand's eagerness to prove himself to the rest of his class. After all, it was only natural that someone would want to look their best on their birthday. Living at Garrigmach meant that Ferdinand had no chance for any larger celebrations, as he had been accustomed to back home. However, he had hoped at least to share tea with his good pal Lawrence after the mock battle had come to a close. Instead, Ferdinand had fallen off his horse unexpectedly. Due to his terrible positioning, his classmates were unprepared to fight around him. Specifically, Hubert had casted a blast of miasma towards the enemy, but then had to redirect it at the last second to avoid harming Ferdinand. In his attempt to not hurt the redhead, the blast of dark magic frightened the poor boy's horse and threw him off his back. It was a newer warhorse, and it was not fully accustomed to the constant stimulation of battle. After hitting the ground, Ferdinand had slowly slipped out of consciousness, while the others all gathered around him. A pit of shame burned in Ferdinand's stomach as he recalled his blunder. It was an embarrassing display to fall off one's horse. The weight of his family's name sat upon his shoulders, and he felt as if he had disgraced it. Watching as the sun continued to lower in a burst of orange and yellow across the sky, Ferdinand knew he had wasted his special day. This date only came once a year, and he had squandered it by being impatient and injuring himself in training. If it had been a real conflict, then some glory could be bestowed upon him for his courageous service. Instead, he was left to rot in the infirmary. He often felt out of place within the academy, especially among his classmates, but he had hoped to at least have a few people wish him well for his birthday. Sulking, he heard the door open and the sound of heels clicking against the floor. From the corner of his eye, Ferdinand spotted Manuela entering the room with her arms full. The older woman walked over to his bedside and placed a small vase with 6 pink tulips, a sealed bag of Leicester tea leaves, and an ornate decorative card with a handwritten message. "Good to see you're awake, Ferdinand. I was afraid you might have had a concussion, but I think you merely got the wind knocked out of you earlier," Manuela said as she pulled over a stool, sitting at the right of his bed. "Good evening to you, Professor. How long have I been here?" Ferdinand asked, before eyeing the 3 items on the nightstand. Manuela leaned over the cot and went to grab Ferdinand by the chin, turning his head left and right. She stared into his pupils, watching them flicker and dilate. When she was satisfied, she let him go and sighed. "A few hours, maybe 4. You have been asleep the entire time, even when a few of your friends came by to check in on you." "Friends?" Ferdinand perked up, scooting closer to the edge of the bed. "Who came to visit?" Manuela found his puppy-like enthusiasm to be charming. While Ferdinand's chipper attitude could be a handful, His intentions were always pure at heart. Edelgard dropped by at first with a card wishing you a rapid recovery. Afterwards, Lauren stopped by with a bag of tea as a gift, though I must say I was surprised when that Vestra boy came along with fresh flowers. As she spoke, Ferdinand clung to her every word. He assumed Edelgard swung by out of obligation as their house leader, but he appreciated the polite gesture. As for Lawrence, Ferdinand presumed his dear friend had merely dropped off the bag of tea leaves that were supposed to be brewed this evening at their tea party. However, Ferdinand was absolutely gobsmacked to hear that Hubert von Vestra had stepped foot into the clinic. Not only had the dastardly maid stopped to check in on him, but he had left a vase filled with pink tulips. Even if Ferdinand had not bumped his head, he could not fathom why Hubert would bother to do something nice for once. I see. That is kind of them to visit me," Ferdinand mumbled. He was unable to tear his eyes away from the flower vase. "Indeed, it was quite kind of them to drop off such gifts on your birthday. I'm sorry to see you spending it here at the clinic, but I'm afraid you will need to stay overnight to be sure that you have not taken any serious damage to your head." Ferdinand was disappointed to learn that he would be sleeping within this cot for the entire evening. He wanted to go back to his room. It was not the most comfortable either, but it was at least his own personal space. Still, a single night in the infirmary was tame compared to the possible injuries he could have received. He nodded solemnly and leaned back against the pillows. "Do you think I will be back to normal by tomorrow, Professor?" he asked with a hopeful gleam in his eyes. He was anxious to get back to his studies and training. He could not afford to fall behind, not while Edelgard was steadily progressing ahead of him. Manuela gave him a half-smile. "You can return to class, but I would not try sparring on that leg just yet. Give it a few more days. You were lucky that nothing broke, but you surely pulled or strained your muscles." "Right. Lucky me." He trailed off with a somber note to his words. "Time will pass by in a blink, Ferdinand. Be patient." She tried to cheer him up before standing and walking over to the cabinets. "Now, let me do a quick examination and give you another tonic for pain relief before I close the infirmary for the evening." "Yes, Professor Manuela." Once Manuela was finished, she left Ferdinand to rest in the clinic. She locked the door so that he could have some privacy and not worry about anyone trying to get into the room while she was off duty. Left with only a single candle flickering and streams of moonlight slipping through the window, Ferdinand was still sitting up in the bed. Now that he was alone again, he reached for the 3 presents that Manuela had left. Ferdinand picked up the sealed tea bag and only noticed a small note attached that had Lauren's signature with a small heart next to it. He then turned his attention to the greeting card. It was an official card from the Hresvelg family. He could tell by the golden embossed double-breasted eagle on the front that bore the family's insignia. When he opened it, he read the small message that had been handwritten by Edelgard. "To Ferdinand, I wish you a swift recovery. Rest for as long as you need. We shall be waiting for your return. Edelgard Hresvelg, on behalf of the Black Eagles." Chewing his bottom lip, Ferdinand folded the card and set it back down. It held good intentions, but he did not enjoy receiving pity from Edelgard. If he were to ever surpass her, then he did not have time to waste. He did not doubt the sincerity of her message, but he almost wished she had not sent one at all. By receiving a card, he felt an odd sense of inferiority once again. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath to calm the rising tide of insecurity before it could overtake his thoughts. Instead, Ferdinand finally turned to the tulips that held a faint fragrance. He pushed his nose up against the silky petals and inhaled. It reminded him of the perfumes some of the women wore around the academy. The scent was sweet, but not overbearing. Reaching over, Ferdinand found a small slip of paper tied around the bottom of the vase with a thin twine. He lifted up the paper and saw only cursive letters spelling out Vestra in all capitals. There was no message, which only stumped Ferdinand further. Why had Hubert bothered with sending a gift if Edelgard had done so for the entire class? For what reason did he have to spend his own gold on flowers for a man he loathed? More questions continued to pop into Ferdinand's mind, but no answers followed. As he began speculating, only 2 possibilities crossed his mind. The first reason Ferdinand could come up with was highly unlikely, since it had been Hubert's magic that had spooked his horse. Had the mage felt partially responsible for the accident? Ferdinand doubted it. Every time that they argued, Hubert never showed a single sign of remorse. Even when the older boy was wrong, he never admitted it or felt guilty. It was hard to believe that Hubert would only now start feeling regret over his cruel words and actions. However, The second option had to be even more ludicrous than the first. Lifting out a tulip from the vase, Ferdinand stared at it and twirled the stem between his fingers. Sending flowers was not the most platonic expression of friendship. Besides, the two men were far from buddies. Yet, Ferdinand's mind began to wander down a dangerous path. What if Hubert had sent these flowers not only as a sign of goodwill, but because he also harbored softer sentiments for him? Instantly, Ferdinand turned cherry red on his cheeks. He was grateful no one was here to witness such an embarrassing sight, as he grew entirely flushed over Hubert. He tried to laugh and toss away the silly notion, but his body suddenly felt inexplicably warm. His palms also began to sweat, as he held the single flower in his hand. Ferdinand could not force himself to chuckle any more, as if it were some sick joke. Indeed, he shamefully began to consider the thought seriously. Could Hubert have feelings for him? No, that was malarkey. The man was nothing more than a snake. Bringing his thumb up to the petals, he traced over them. It was preposterous to imagine Hubert caring about anyone who was not Edelgard. Unless he acted harshly to throw Ferdinand off of his trail. Ferdinand's mind became a puzzle as he tried to fit the jagged pieces together. When he tried to imagine Hubert in a romantic sense, he was not disgusted. In fact, he was, shockingly, intrigued by the idea. Hubert often said such horrible things to him. But what if he were to whisper sweet nothings into his ear? His deep voice was rather alluring, if Ferdinand was being honest with himself. He shivered at the thought of Hubert saying something scandalous in a hushed tone that only he could hear. Groaning, Ferdinand hated how his protective barriers were crumbling at his feet. He would be a liar if he tried to say he never considered Hubert as a man. The older boy was handsome, in an enigmatic sense of the word. His black hair shrouded in calculating expressions, and his green eyes pierced deeply wherever he looked. His jawline was much more defined than Ferdinand's own soft cheeks, and Hubert often carried himself with a mysterious poise that struck Ferdinand's fancy. "Goddess," he mumbled to himself, plucking the first petal off the tulip. "He loves me." Ferdinand plucked another petal. "He loves me not." A third petal is torn off. "He loves me." Continuously, Ferdinand plucked each petal from that singular tulip. It was a childish game to play. What divination could be derived from something so silly? Yet he did not stop. He plucked over and over, until reaching the final petal. Gasping, he tore the pink petal with his fingertips, and trembled. He loves me." Ferdinand stared in disbelief at the scattered petals on his lap. That couldn't be true. Hubert had feelings for him. It was impossible. A man as cold-hearted as Hubert could never hold such saccharine sentiments. But the vase of flowers said otherwise. Going against logic, Ferdinand felt his mind unraveling at this discovery. Sweet Sothis above! Is it truly a sign? Ferdinand pressed his hands together in prayer, questioning his faith. A small gust of wind blew through the cracked window, lifting the petals before they fell upon the woven blanket once again. Ferdinand gathered them and quickly placed them on the table next to his cot. Trying to decipher if his cry had been answered with positive affirmation or not, Ferdinand turned over and pressed his face into the pillow. He muffled a scream into it. There would be no sleep for him tonight. How could he rest when his mind was running wild with thoughts about how pretty Hubert might actually be beneath his stoic exterior? Squirming on the cot, Ferdinand whined and shut his eyes tight. This was the worst birthday. He was falling for Hubert von Vestra.